What would you do if the only thing your father left you was a handful of dust and a worthless piece of paper? For Rose Whitcomb, this wasn't a question to be pondered. It was the sharp, bitter reality of an Arizona morning in 1883. She stood beside her father's grave, a simple wooden cross on a rented plot of land, while a man named Silas Croft, the agent for the Verde Land and Cattle Company, explained with a smug satisfaction that the lease her father had paid on for 10 years was invalid. A clerical error, he'd called it. A forgotten signature. A legal fiction that meant the cabin, the well, the small patch of hard-won garden, none of it was hers. It had never even truly been her father's. But what waited for her, hidden in the ancient stone of the canyon walls, was a truth far older and more powerful than any deed or signature. A secret that would not only give her a home, but a weapon. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell a story of quiet courage and buried justice. Rose Whitcomb watched the dust settle on the wagon tracks that carried away the last of her life. Croft's men had been efficient, piling her few belongings. A worn trunk, a set of her mother's china wrapped in burlap, her father's tools, into the bed of a company wagon with the detached air of men clearing away rubble. They'd left her with a single horse, an aging gray gelding named Dusty, and a canvas sack containing a bit of flour, some salted pork, and a tin of coffee. It was, Croft had announced with a magnanimous wave of his hand, a gesture of goodwill. Rose knew it for what it was, the final insult. She stood in the shadow of the cabin her father had built, beam by beam, his sweat and hope soaked into the very grain of the wood. Now it belonged to the company. Everything did. Her father, John Whitcomb, had been a quiet man, a believer in honest work and the integrity of a handshake. He'd spoken of the Verde Land Company with a grudging respect, believing them to be hard but fair. He'd died believing that. He'd worked himself into the grave to pay for a piece of paper that Croft had torn in two before her very eyes, the sound as sharp and final as a bone snapping. The grief she'd carried for the past month, a heavy, cold stone in her chest, was now joined by a searing, helpless anger. She was 27 years old, alone, with no family to turn to and no money to speak of. The town of Redemption was a day's ride east, but she knew what she'd find there. Pity from a few, suspicion from most, and no real help from anyone. A lone woman was a problem to be solved, married off or driven out. She turned her back on the cabin, refusing to give Croft the satisfaction of her tears. Her gaze fell upon the vast, impassive face of the canyon that bordered the claim. Red rock rose in sheer walls, sculpted by millennia of wind and water into cathedrals of stone. It was a harsh, beautiful, and utterly indifferent landscape. It promised nothing, but it was the only direction left to go. She swung herself onto Dusty's back, his familiar warmth a small comfort against the chill of her predicament. She didn't have a destination. She was simply moving away from the place where her life had been unmade. She would ride until she found a place to make camp, some small overhang or cave where she could shelter from the coming night and the predators, both four-legged and two-legged, that roamed this territory. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the canyon walls in hues of fire and blood. She urged Dusty forward, his hooves making soft, shuffling sounds in the deep red dust, leaving the stolen ghost of her home behind her. The canyon watched, silent and ancient, holding its breath. It had seen stories like hers play out 1,000 times, but this time it held a secret of its own, waiting for the right hands to uncover it. The canyon air grew cool as the sun dipped below the western rim, leaving the world in a wash of deep purple and bruised orange. Rose had been riding for hours, following a narrow game trail that hugged the base of the towering cliffs. She was looking for an alcove, a defensible space with access to water, however meager. Her father had taught her how to read the land, how to find the places where life clung on. But here, the rock was sheer and unforgiving. The day's anger had cooled into a familiar, aching exhaustion. She dismounted, letting Dusty graze on a patch of tough, dry grass while she scanned the cliff face one last time before making a cold camp in the open. It was then she saw it. Almost perfectly concealed by a thick, thorny tangle of catclaw acacia was a faint, unnatural line in the rock. It wasn't a fissure or a crack. It was a shadow, too straight, too regular. Curiosity, a feeling she thought had been burned out of her, flickered to life. She pushed through the sharp branches, ignoring the scratches on her arms and hands, and stepped into the space behind them. There, carved directly into the sandstone cliff, was a narrow staircase. The steps were worn smooth by time and weather, each one barely wide enough for a single person, ascending steeply into the shadows above. They were so old, so weathered, that they seemed less like something man-made and more like a strange geological formation. But they were deliberate. Someone long ago had spent an incredible amount of time and effort carving this secret path into the heart of the rock. Her heart beat a little faster. This was no prospector's folly. This was a hidden road to a hidden place. She looked up, but the top was lost in the deepening twilight. It was a fool's errand to climb it now, a good way to break a neck. Yet, the thought of spending the night on the exposed canyon floor, vulnerable and alone, was a far more terrifying prospect. She tied Dusty's reins to a sturdy ironwood shrub, giving him enough slack to find water if he scented it, and began to climb. Her worn boots found purchase on the stone, her fingers gripping the rough wall for balance. The air grew thinner, cooler. After 50 feet, she had to stop, her lungs burning, and look down. The canyon floor was already a distant, dark ribbon. She was committed. She kept climbing, the world narrowing to the next step, the next handhold. Finally, her hand touched not rock, but wood. She'd reached a small, level ledge, no bigger than a wagon bed, tucked into a deep recess in the cliff. And built into that recess, its back wall the living rock itself, was a small cabin. It was made of thick, hand-hewn timbers, silvered with age, and chinked with mud that had long since petrified. The door was a single, solid slab of wood, held shut by a heavy iron bar dropped into 2 brackets. It was sealed, untouched, waiting. A 60-year silence seemed to emanate from it, a silence so profound it felt like a presence. With a deep breath, she put her shoulder to the door, feeling the immense, stubborn weight of time itself pushing back. What would you do in her place? Would you have dared to climb those stairs into the unknown with nothing but a desperate hope to guide you? What secrets do you think are sealed inside that forgotten cabin, left untouched for more than half a century? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're enjoying this story of resilience on the frontier, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more tales of hidden history. Now, let's see what Rose finds behind that sealed door. Rose had to find a pry bar. She descended the stone steps carefully, her mind racing. The cabin was a fortress, a sanctuary suspended between earth and sky. It felt impossible, a dream conjured by exhaustion and despair. Back on the canyon floor, She rummaged through her father's tool roll. He'd been a meticulous man, and his tools were his pride. She found a long, heavy crowbar, its steel cool and solid in her hands. The climb back up was harder with the added weight, but adrenaline fueled her ascent. Back on the ledge, she wedged the tip of the crowbar between the heavy door and its frame and leaned into it with all her weight. The old wood groaned, a deep, mournful sound that echoed in the enclosed space. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a crack like a pistol shot, the iron brackets holding the bar shattered from the strain, rusted through by decades of silent decay. The door swung inward into absolute blackness. A gust of air rushed out, carrying a scent she couldn't place. Stale, dry, and ancient, like the air from a pharaoh's tomb. A mix of dry wood, dust, leather, and something else. Something faintly spicy, like dried herbs. She needed light. She climbed down a third time, her legs trembling with effort, and retrieved the lantern and a tin of matches. When she returned, she lit the wick, the small flame chasing the profound darkness back into the corners of the cabin. The interior was small, no more than a single room, but it was a marvel of preservation. A thick layer of dust covered everything, but beneath it, the cabin was perfectly intact. A sturdy table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A narrow cot with a neatly folded wool blanket, now stiff as a board, was pushed against one wall. On a set of shelves were tins and jars, their contents long since turned to dust and mystery. Sacks of what might have been flour or beans were slumped in a corner, hard as rock. A fireplace was built into the rock wall, its hearth clean and swept. And hanging from wooden pegs were tools of a life lived in isolation. A well-oiled rifle, a brace of pistols in a leather holster, a coiled rope, and a canteen. It was a time capsule, a life interrupted and sealed away. Her journey to the town of Redemption the next morning was a necessity. The cabin held the promise of shelter, but she needed supplies. Flour, salt, coffee, things that hadn't turned to stone over 60 years. As she rode Dusty along the main street, a dusty track lined with false-fronted buildings, she felt the familiar weight of eyes upon her. The townspeople watched from the shaded boardwalks, their whispers following her like flies. They knew who she was, John Whitcomb's girl, the one who'd lost everything. She tied Dusty outside the general store and stepped inside, the bell above the door announcing her arrival. And there, leaning against the counter, was Silas Croft. He turned, a wide, mocking grin spreading across his face. "Well, look what the canyon coughed up," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "I thought you'd be halfway to the next territory by now, girlie." Rose ignored him, her face a stoic mask as she handed her list to the storekeeper. Croft continued, enjoying his audience. "Still hanging around? There's nothing for you here. The Verde Land Company owns this valley, lock, stock, and barrel." As Rose paid for her supplies with the last of her coins, an old man sitting by the pot-bellied stove shifted in his chair. He was ancient, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes a pale, watery blue. He was Jebediah, a prospector who'd been wandering these hills since before Redemption was even a town. He watched her gather her sacks, his gaze sharp and knowing. As she turned to leave, he spoke, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "Some walls are built to keep folks out," he said, not to her, but to the air in front of him. "Others are built to keep a truth in." Rose paused at the door, the strange words hanging in the silent store. Croft scoffed, dismissing the old man's words as senile rambling, but Rose held them. She didn't understand what they meant, but they felt heavy, like a key to a lock she hadn't yet found. She stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, the prospector's cryptic warning echoing in her mind, a new and unsettling layer to the mystery of the cabin in the cliff. The journey back to the cabin felt different. The sacks of supplies tied behind her saddle were a tangible anchor, a claim on the future. The weight of Croft's mockery and the town's pity felt distant now, insignificant against the stark, silent majesty of the canyon. This time, as she climbed the stone stairs, she wasn't a desperate refugee seeking shelter. She was returning home. The air on the ledge was clean and cool, a world away from the dusty, judgmental streets of redemption. Inside, she set about making the space her own. The first task was to conquer the dust. She used an old broom she found propped in a corner, its bristles stiff but serviceable, and swept 60 years of stillness out the door. The dust motes danced in the shafts of late-afternoon sun slanting through the single glass-paned window, a silent storm of golden particles. As she worked, she began to notice the details of the cabin's construction, the intelligence and care of its anonymous builder. The timbers were fitted with a shipwright's precision. The shelves were perfectly level. Every peg, every hook, had a purpose. This was not the work of a common drifter. It was the work of a man who planned to stay. That night, she cooked a simple meal of flapjacks and bacon over a small fire in the stone hearth. The flue drew perfectly, pulling the smoke up and out into the vast night sky. It was the first hot meal she'd had in days, and it tasted like a feast. Outside, Dusty nickered softly from the ledge where she'd secured him, his presence a comforting, living warmth in the immense solitude. After she ate, she sat in one of the sturdy wooden chairs, the lantern casting a warm, gentle glow around her. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the history of the place. She imagined the man who had lived here, carving out this impossible existence. Was he an outlaw? A recluse? A man escaping a past he couldn't outrun? The rifle and pistols suggested a life of violence, but the order and cleanliness of the cabin suggested a man of discipline. He was a paradox, a ghost whose presence was so strong it felt as though he had just stepped out and might return at any moment. She ran her hand along the rough-sawn wood of the table, her fingers tracing the grain. The cabin was more than just shelter. It was a legacy. It had been waiting, patient and silent, for someone to find it, to wake it from its long sleep. As she banked the fire and prepared for bed, rolling out her own bedroll on the cot, a sense of profound peace settled over her. She was high above the world, safe in her fortress of stone and wood. For the first time since her father's death, she felt not the crushing weight of loss, but the first, tentative stirring of hope. The canyon wind whispered around the corners of the cabin, a low, ancient song. It was a lullaby of stone and stars, and for the first time in a very long time, Rose Whitcomb slept without fear, unaware that the cabin's greatest secret still lay buried, waiting for her touch. A secret that would confirm the old prospector's words, a truth that had been walled in for a generation. The next few days fell into a rhythm of labor and discovery. Rose was not idle by nature. Work was the only prayer her father had taught her. She aired out the stiff wool blanket, beating clouds of dust from it until it smelled of sun and clean air. She scrubbed the floorboards with a coarse brush, and water she hauled in a bucket from a seep spring she'd found a quarter-mile down the canyon. The physical exertion was a balm, quieting the grief and anger that still churned inside her. With each stroke of the brush, each bucket of water hauled up the steep steps, she was washing away not just the grime of decades, But the feeling of helplessness that had clung to her since Croft had torn up her father's lease. She was building something again, not with wood and nails, but with her own sweat and determination. She was making this forgotten place her own. As she worked, she became intimately familiar with every inch of the small cabin. She learned the way the light moved across the room during the day, from a sharp, bright blade in the morning to a soft, amber glow in the evening. She knew the particular groan of the floorboard near the hearth, the subtle draft that came from a gap in the window frame. It was this deep, physical knowing of the space that led her to the first real clue. While scrubbing the hearthstones, her hand brushed across one that was different from the others. It was the same color, the same texture, but it sat just a fraction of an inch lower than its neighbors, and when she pressed on its edge, it shifted, just barely, with a faint grinding sound. It was an anomaly, a detail that didn't fit the perfection of the rest of the cabin's construction. The man who built this place would not have tolerated a loose stone in his hearth. It was deliberate. She thought of Jebediah's words. Others are built to keep a truth in. A chill went down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself it was just a settled stone, a quirk of time and geology. But the thought nagged at her, a persistent whisper in the back of her mind. For 2 days, she avoided it, working on other tasks, mending a shutter, clearing the cat claw from the base of the stairs. But her eyes kept drifting back to the hearth, to that one stone that was not quite right. It was a silent invitation, a question posed in rock and mortar. The cabin had given her shelter, a refuge from the world. But she was beginning to understand that it was asking for something in return. It was asking her to listen, to look closer, to uncover the story that it had been guarding so faithfully for all these years. On the 3rd day, she could ignore it no longer. The sun was high, filling the cabin with honest, unforgiving light. She knelt before the fireplace, her heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She took a deep breath, wedged her fingers into the tiny gap around the edge of the stone, and pulled. The stone was heavy, sealed tight by years of accumulated soot and grit. At first it wouldn't budge. Rose set her jaw, remembering the stubborn set of her father's when he was faced with a problem that wouldn't yield. She went to his tool roll and came back with a small chisel and a hammer. Carefully, she worked the tip of the chisel into the crack, gently tapping the end with the hammer. She worked her way around the stone, chipping away at the seal, the sharp tink, tink, tink of metal on stone, the only sound in the silent cabin. Finally, she felt a loosening. She put the tools aside, gripped the edges of the stone with both hands, and lifted. It came free with a grating sound, heavy and solid in her hands. She set it carefully on the floor beside the hearth and peered into the darkness of the cavity beneath. It was a small, neatly squared-off space, just big enough to hold a secret. And nestled inside, wrapped in a thick, oiled hide, was a rectangular package tied with a leather thong. Her hands trembled as she reached into the hole and lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked. She placed it on the table, the dust on the surface swirling around it. Dusty, who had been dozing in the sun on the ledge, seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. He lifted his head and let out a soft, low whicker, his ears pricked forward. Rose's gaze was fixed on the package. This was it. This was the truth the wall had been built to keep in. For a long moment, she just looked at it, her mind a whirlwind of fear and anticipation. Whatever was inside this bundle had been important enough for a man to build a fortress around it, to hide it beneath his own hearth. Uncovering it felt like a trespass, like disturbing a grave. But she knew she had to. Her own story had become inexplicably tangled with the story of this cabin and its long-dead owner. With unsteady fingers, she began to untie the stiff leather thong, the silence of the cabin pressing in around her, thick and expectant. The past was about to speak, and she was the only one there to listen. The leather thong crumbled in her fingers as she finally worked the knot free. She folded back the stiff, cracked layers of oiled hide. The material had done its job perfectly, protecting its contents from moisture and the passage of time. Inside, resting on a bed of what looked like dried sage leaves, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. It was the kind a merchant or a clerk might use, its cover plain and unadorned, worn smooth at the corners from use. It felt heavy in her hands, not just with its physical weight, but with the weight of its secrets. She carried it to the table and sat down, the afternoon light falling across the page as she opened it to the beginning. The first page bore a single name, written in a precise, elegant script that was at odds with the image of a rough outlaw. Jonathan Keene, 1823. She turned the page. The entries began not as a journal of daily life, but as a meticulous accounting. Keene, it seemed, had been a surveyor by trade. The first several pages were filled with complex drawings of property lines, notes on water rights, and calculations of acreage, all rendered with an artist's care. But then, the nature of the entries began to change. Interspersed with the surveying notes were narrative passages, written in the same neat hand, but with a growing sense of urgency and anger. Jonathan Keene, she pieced together, had been hired in the 1820s by a fledgling land speculation company out of Santa Fe. His job was to survey and register the old Spanish and Mexican land grants in the territory, preparing them for sale to American settlers. But Keene had quickly discovered that the company's ambitions were criminal. He began to document their methods in his ledger. He wrote of forged documents, of threats made against local families, of deeds being altered to expand the company's holdings. He was chronicling a systematic campaign of theft, all under the guise of legal enterprise. Rose's blood ran cold when she read the name of the company. The Verde Land Development Syndicate. It was the original name, the precursor to the Verde Land and Cattle Company that had taken her father's claim. The same company, the same crime, separated by 60 years. Keene had realized the danger he was in. He wrote of being followed, of his questions being met with veiled threats. He knew his ledger was a death warrant. That was when he had disappeared, faking his own death in a supposed riding accident and retreating to the canyon. He had carved the stairs himself, built the cabin, and created his fortress of solitude, living as a ghost while the company he meant to expose grew into an empire. The ledger became his only confidant. He documented every stolen parcel of land, every swindled family, every lie the Verde Company built its foundations upon. He listed names, dates, and the specific legal trickery used. It was a comprehensive indictment, a 60-year-old testimony from the grave. Near the end of the book, he wrote of his failing health, of the loneliness that was a constant ache in his chest. The final entry was dated 1831. "I have kept the faith," he wrote. "This book is my witness. May it one day find its way into honest hands." And then, silence. Rose closed the ledger, her hands shaking. The cabin was not an outlaw's hideout. It was a witness protection box. And Jonathan Keene hadn't been an outlaw. He had been the first man to stand up to the Verde Land Company. She looked around the small room, seeing it now not as a refuge but as an arsenal. The truth Jebediah spoke of was here, in her hands. And it was a weapon. A week later, the fragile piece of her sanctuary was shattered. She was cleaning the long rifle, the familiar weight of it in her hands a comfort, when she heard the sound. It was faint at first, the clatter of shod hooves on loose rock from the canyon floor below. It wasn't the sound of a lone rider. It was several, moving with purpose. She hurried to the edge of the ledge and peered down. 3 riders were dismounting at the base of the cliff. One of them was Silas Croft. He pointed up, directly at her. He had found her. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. There was nowhere to run. She was trapped. She backed into the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. She grabbed the ledger, her first instinct to protect it, to protect Jonathan Keene's legacy. Croft's voice floated up, thin and mocking. "I know you're up there, Whitcomb, hiding in the rocks like a lizard. That's company land you're squatting on." She heard them starting up the stairs, their boots scraping on the stone. She barred the door, the new bar she'd fashioned from a heavy piece of ironwood dropping into place. It wouldn't hold them for long. She loaded the rifle, her hands clumsy with fear. She was a fair shot. Her father had seen to that, but she had never pointed a gun at another person in her life. As Croft's men began to throw their weight against the door, a new sound joined the chaos. The sharp, authoritative crack of a single pistol shot from below. The assault on her door stopped. Curses and shouts echoed up from the base of the stairs. Risking a look out the window, Rose saw a 4th rider, a man on a powerful bay horse, holding a pistol leveled at Croft's 2 hired men. He was tall, with a lean, weathered face and the calm, steady posture of a man who knew how to handle himself. It was Thomas Avery. Avery was a former deputy from a town 2 counties over. He'd retired to a small ranch nearby after his wife died, keeping to himself. Rose knew him only by sight, but she knew his reputation. Quiet, honest, and unshakable. He must have heard the talk in Redemption and come to check on her. "That's far enough, Croft," Avery called out, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. "This is between me and the girl," Croft snarled. "She's on company property. From where I'm sitting, it looks like she's on a rock ledge, and you're the one trespassing," Avery replied evenly. Just then, the sky, which had been growing dark and bruised all afternoon, opened up. A sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled through the canyon, unleashing a torrent of rain. The wind howled, and lightning cracked across the sky. Croft and his men, caught in the open, were forced to retreat, shouting threats that were swallowed by the storm. Rose watched them go, then turned as she heard a knock on her door. "Miss Whitcomb?" Avery's voice was close now. "It's Thomas Avery. I think we ought to talk." She slid the bar back and opened the door to him. He stood there, soaked to the skin, his hat in his hand. He looked at her, then at the rifle she was still holding, and gave a small, respectful nod. "Looks like you found yourself some trouble," he said. "Or maybe," she replied, finding her voice, "it finally found me." Thomas Avery stepped inside, dripping rainwater onto the floorboards, and the small cabin suddenly felt much safer. He looked around, his eyes taking in the neatness of the room, the rifle in her hands, and the old ledger sitting on the table. He was a man who noticed details. Rose offered him a cup of coffee, and he accepted with a quiet thanks. As the storm raged outside, a wild symphony of wind and rain, she told him everything. She told him about her father, about Croft's eviction, and about finding the cabin. Then, she opened the ledger and showed him Jonathan Keene's story. He listened patiently, his gaze never leaving her face, his expression shifting from gentle concern to a hard, focused intensity as he understood the magnitude of what she had found. He took the ledger, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle with the fragile pages. He read passages aloud, his voice low and steady, the names of families and the descriptions of stolen claims filling the small room. "I knew it," he murmured, tracing a line of text with his finger. "I always heard stories, old-timers talking about how the Verde Company got its start. But they were just whispers. No proof." He looked up at her, his eyes full of a grim respect. "This isn't just proof, Miss Whitcomb. This is a confession written by their own man." He explained that the local sheriff in Redemption was a company man, bought and paid for. Taking the ledger to him would be like handing it back to Croft. Their only chance was to go to the territorial capital in Prescott and present it to the U.S. Marshal. It was a long, dangerous ride, and Croft would surely be watching for them. "He won't let this go," Avery said. "He knows you found something up here. He'll be back, and he'll bring more men." He was right. The cabin was a fortress, but they couldn't hide there forever. They had to act. They left before dawn 2 days later, the storm having passed, leaving the air washed clean and the red rock gleaming. They traveled light and fast, using the knowledge of the land Avery possessed from his years as a lawman. He led them through hidden canyons and over high mesas, avoiding the main roads where Croft's men would be waiting. During the day, they rode hard, and at night, they made cold camps, taking turns on watch. Rose had never felt so alive. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a powerful sense of purpose. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her father's memory, for Jonathan Keene, and for every family whose name was written in that ledger. She and Avery spoke little, but a bond of trust and mutual respect formed between them in the shared silence of the trail. He treated her not as a woman in need of rescue, but as a capable partner. When they finally rode into Prescott, a bustling town of brick buildings and hopeful ambition, they went straight to the marshal's office. Marshal Clayton was a formidable man with eyes that seemed to see right through you. He listened to their story without interruption, his expression unreadable. When they finished, he took the ledger and spent the better part of an hour examining it in silence. Finally, he closed the book and looked at them. "I've been a lawman in this territory for 20 years, he said, his voice a low rumble. "I've seen my share of land fraud. But this—" He shook his head slowly. "This is the work of generations. It's the root of the whole damn tree." He stood up and offered Rose his hand. "Miss Whitcomb, you have done this territory a great service, a dangerous one. Let us see that your courage is rewarded." The vindication had begun. The news traveled slowly at first, then like a flash flood. U.S. Marshals descended on the Verde Land and Cattle Company's offices, armed with federal warrants. Silas Croft was arrested, his blustering rage turning to pale, sweaty fear when he was faced with a power he couldn't buy or bully. The investigation, fueled by the irrefutable proof in Keene's ledger, uncovered a web of corruption that reached into every corner of the territory. The town of Redemption, which had once dismissed Rose as a pitiable orphan, now spoke her name with a mixture of awe and reverence. People she'd never met would nod to her on the street. Families whose grandparents' names were in the ledger came to thank her, their eyes filled with tears for a justice they thought long dead. The chorus of whispers that had once mocked her now sang her praise. Croft was humbled, his empire built on stolen land and broken lives crumbling into dust. He was a small man, stripped of his power, awaiting a trial he could not win. The legal battle to restore the claims was long and arduous, but with the ledger as their guide, the tide had turned. The truth, once walled in, was now setting the people of the valley free. Months later, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the canyon, warming the red rock and deepening the shadows. Rose stood on the ledge outside the cabin, looking out over the valley that was now, legally and truly, hers. The deed to her father's original claim, along with the parcel of land the cabin itself stood on, was safe in a small wooden box inside. Thomas Avery stood beside her, hammering a loose railing into place. He had become a constant, quiet presence in her life, helping her repair the cabin, build a proper corral for the horses, and navigate the complexities of her new life. He never presumed, never pushed. He simply stood with her, a partner in work and in silence. The air was peaceful, filled with the scent of pine and dust and the distant call of a hawk circling on the thermals. Inside, Jonathan Keene's ledger lay open on the table, a silent testament to the journey she had taken. It was more than a book now. It was a part of her, a part of the history of this place. The community had begun to heal. Other families were having their lands restored, the great lie of the Verde Company undone piece by piece. Thomas finished his work and came to stand beside her at the edge of the ledge. He looked out at the vast expanse, the same view Jonathan Keene must have watched for years. "It's a good place," he said softly. "It deserves a name." Rose thought for a moment, her gaze sweeping from the distant mountains to the cabin behind her, the fortress that had saved her. She thought of the man who built it, the truth he had guarded, and the justice it had finally delivered. A small, sure smile touched her lips. "I think it's always been called justice," she said. It wasn't a home built of wood or stone, but of courage. It was the inheritance her father had truly left her, a legacy she had earned not with a deed, but with a refusal to be broken. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet strength and the enduring power of truth. It's a reminder that sometimes the most valuable things are not the ones we own, but the ones we have the courage to defend. If this story resonated with you, please leave a like and a comment below. And be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales from the heart of the frontier. We'll see you in the next story.